Down,
Here it
down.
comes.
For 77 days, hell came to Earth in a small plateau in Khe Sanh, South Vietnam. Though Americans fought and won this impossible task, the sacrifice and consequences haunted them throughout the next arduous few years of the American involvement in South Vietnam. For the young Marines, just surviving was a triumph, but the tragic memories of the battle would change them forever. And while the Marines may have won, it proved to Americans the North Vietnamese could not be beaten. In November of 1955, the Communist government of North Vietnam invaded its capitalist neighbor, South Vietnam. The invasion prompted President Kennedy to send U.S. troops to aid the South Vietnamese army. The fighting lasted for nearly 20 years, leading to tens of thousands U.S. and Vietnamese casualties. Despite 2 decades of conflict, the war's most critical and bloodiest period occurred just 3 months after the beginning of 1968. The battles waged at this time led directly to the ultimate victory of the North Vietnamese, and to what many consider the first major defeat in U.S. military history. At the center of it all was Khe Sanh.
Marine Private First Class John Corbett captured the experience on February 10th, 1968, writing in his journal, "My mind wanders. My mind and body are exhausted. We have been a target for incoming fire for more than 3 weeks. I want and need sleep, but I can't. Instead, I find myself just waiting for the sun to come up in the morning. I know it will be hours before it rises. At least when it does, this night, like previous nights, will finally end." Since the beginning of our nation, the United States Marine Corps has valiantly served our country and has defended the ideals of our democracy with their lives. The U.S. 26th Marine Division, known for the defeat of the Japanese compound on Iwo Jima, was assigned to the air base in Khe Sanh, South Vietnam. Located south of the demilitarization zone and along the North Vietnamese-held Route 9, Khe Sanh blocked enemy maneuvers towards Saigon and Laos. General Westmoreland, the Supreme Commander of U.S.-led forces in Vietnam, considered the base a major player in stopping communist forces from capturing South Vietnam.
For weeks, the enemy has made intensive preparations for combat there. Yet no United States military officer can predict with certainty that the North Vietnamese will make a sustained assault against the American Marine stronghold at Khe Sanh. The New York Times. Viet Cong strategists strongly felt that for victory, they would need to isolate American forces in order to create a diversion that would allow the South Vietnamese to rise up against the Americans, keeping them captive. 40 to 50,000 NVA troops surrounded the Americans, forming a tight offensive position, and pounded night and day on the Americans with Soviet and Chinese-made mortars and artillery fire. As never before in the bewildering warfare of Vietnam, the forces of the United States and North Vietnam are gathered for battle, and world attention is focused on one point: Khe Sanh, the New York Times. The 26th Battalion of 5,000 to 6,000 Marines, reinforced with a few hundred Army Special Forces, and South Vietnamese Rangers held the ground with makeshift bunkers and foxholes, waiting for Air Force bombings. Bombs and napalm fell on enemy positions a few hundred yards away from the hunkered-down Marines. Under the protective cover of fog, the NVA shelled the Khe Sanh base 24/7.
20th of January is when, all hell broke loose. And they attacked both A-61 and the base in full strength with this enormous artillery barrage. Cut the road and basically cut the base off. The actual, quote, siege was about 2 months. I think there were roughly 6,000 Marines at the base, and there were roughly 40,000 NVA surrounding us. They had this enormous advantage in terms of artillery and so forth. And they were just slamming the base every day. The advantage we had that, say, for example, the French didn't have at Dien Bien Phu was air power. As the siege went on and the weather got better, right, air power just decimated these guys.
President Johnson immediately ordered for a scale model of the battlefield to be built in the Situation Room, and reportedly spent many late nights monitoring the battle. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the 26th struggles to hold their ground for a looming frontal assault. The nearby Army Special Forces base falls to an NVA armored division with tanks and military force unforeseen by U.S. intelligence. As U.S. casualties skyrocket and air support becomes more and more limited, the desperate Marines were beginning to rely on increased supply runs by Air Force helicopter brigades. Flying helicopters became easy targets for North Vietnamese communists, and without cover of crucial air support, it became the equivalent of a suicide mission. Commander Westmoreland, still believing Khe Sanh was the main attack, consults with the Department of Defense on the possible and risky use of a nuclear warhead against the bunkered NVA forces. None is authorized.
The enemy continued their small ground attacks throughout the winter, only breaking the perimeter once or twice. But American Marines were surprised at each attack's ferocity and strength that had never been seen in previous battles. Still, a possible large-scale ground attack loomed, and military officials became more and more concerned about whether Americans would have enough supplies and troops to withstand. But soon U.S. Marines noticed a continuous slowing of enemy mortar fire. Finally, an end was coming to the bloodshed. While Air Force bombings forced a final enemy retreat, officials discussed what to do next. They finally agreed on a tactical retreat, in fear that the NVA would double back or reinforce with even more troops. The 26th left behind a small communications outpost and left the base deserted. In the battle, 291 Marines were killed and 1,459 were injured. 34 members of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam were killed in action. 10,000 to 15,000 North Vietnamese Army commandos were killed.
John Cavani served as a platoon leader to a security platoon at a radio relay site established at Khe Sanh after the battle. Enemy forces launched a major ground attack in an attempt to completely annihilate the remaining small American force. Cavani returned fire but was unable to slow them down. He ordered the remaining platoon members to attempt to escape while he provided them with cover fire. The citation vividly describes, "With one last courageous exertion, Sergeant Cavani recovered a machine gun, stood up, completely exposing himself to heavy enemy fire directed at him, and began firing the machine gun in a sweeping motion along the two ranks of advancing enemy soldiers. Through Sergeant Cavani's valiant efforts with complete disregard for his safety, the majority of the remaining platoon members were able to escape. Sergeant Cavani was wounded numerous times, was captured, and spent the next 2 years as a prisoner of war."
The Marines triumphed in their goal of holding Khe Sanh, but the cost was great. The hundreds of lives, the American morale, and the will of the troops and their leaders all were lost. While those tragedies discouraged Americans, new hope was found by the North Vietnamese, leading to the fall of South Vietnam. As famous newscaster Walter Cronkite said just weeks after the battle,
"To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion.